Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House, and I am from the Houston Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be great. Today we're going to be looking at Leviticus 25. This chapter is dealing with something called the Year of Jubilee. We're going to talk about what that is. We're going to unpack it a little bit. And what we're going to notice, a couple of things that we're going to see in the text from Leviticus 25, is that there was an expectation on the people of Israel to take care of one another. And this is repeated in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, several times just in this chapter alone. First of all, you'll notice in verse 14, it says, you shall not wrong one another. You come down to verse 17, you shall not wrong one another. Well, again, this expectation of treating each other in a certain way was really hinging upon the fact that because Yahweh is your God, watch this, you shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God. Why? For I am the Lord your God. So there was an expectation of behavior because of who God is. Because their God was Yahweh, they should treat each other right. There should be this reverence for God, this reverence for his people. So we're going to notice as we go through this chapter that some of these principles that are set forth are based off of this idea that you don't treat each other wrong. You treat each other right. You treat each other in the right way. And we're also going to notice in this chapter that the Israelites were not to be enslaved to anybody else. Well, why not? Ultimately, they were not to be enslaved to anyone else because God was their master. And so while they may find themselves in a need to serve others, they should never be the slave of others. We'll come down here real quickly. We're going to look at this a little bit more detail in a minute, but look at verse 39. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. So there was an expectation that they would not be slaves. Again, why is that? Because they belong to God. Look at verse 42. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. And again, this expectation to treat each other well is again seen here in verse 43. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, right? When they were in Egypt, Egypt ruled over them ruthlessly. They were taskmasters. God says you're not supposed to do that. I don't want my people to be enslaved to others. And you, talking to the people of Israel, you certainly should not do that to your own people. So there was an expectation to treat each other well. There was this expectation that they don't enslave one another, that they may have to serve as bondservants, but they should never be enslaved. And so it's really interesting, again, to notice these things. Let's back up here a little bit and let's see what the year of Jubilee was in a little more detail. Let's back up here to verse 8. So actually, it's essentially 7 years of 7. So 7 times 7, 49 years. So we come to verse 9. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet. And the trumpet that they would have sounded would have been this ancient ram's horn, a shofar. And so they would blow this horn on this day of Jubilee. So every 50th year was the year of Jubilee. So 7 times 7, 49. So on the Day of Atonement, how interesting is it that on the Day of Atonement, and again, just to kind of remind you of what the Day of Atonement was, once a year. So once a year, the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the people of Israel, to wash away the sins, so that Israel could be cleansed of their sins. So the Day of Atonement was a day of cleansing. Every 50th year, on the Day of Atonement, there was to be the blowing of the ram's horn, the shofar. They were to blow that horn, and they were to declare that day a holy day. Chapter Leviticus 25, verse 12. Not only was it a holy day, but let's go back to that. He says, then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. Well, what day is that? That's the Day of Atonement. You shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty. And this word here means a release from slavery. You shall proclaim a release from slavery throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. So what does that mean? Each of you shall return to his property. Each of you shall return to his clan. So there was going to be a time of returning. And this again is kind of interesting because this word return occurs, I believe, 11 times in chapter 25. You can go back and double check me on that. And so that word occurs time and time again in this chapter. Return, recover, payback. You can see that here that pops up several times. So again, you can go back and check how many times that occurs. But the idea is that you shall return these things to them. So why is that important? Well, there's two things that are really happening here on the year of Jubilee. One, there was a return of the land. If you had become poor and through a need to get out of debt, a need to find a way to take care of your family, you had been left an inheritance, right? One of the great promises given to Abraham in Genesis 12 was a promise of land. So God gave to these people this land promise. But what if you found yourself not being able to pay your bills? You were in great debt. Well, you could sell your property. But it really wasn't a sell. It was a giving of your property to that individual. You were selling it in a sense that you received money for it. But on the Jubilee, it was going to return to whoever it had originally belonged to. Well, ultimately, the land didn't belong to them, to anybody. You look at verse 23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. Because this land was God's. It was his gift. It was his inheritance, his allotment to the people of Israel. But that land was to stay within a certain family, a certain clan. So you could, for a time, sell your property, if you will. And I'm going to use the word sell with that meaning, right? It was a short-term sell, with the understanding that on the year of Jubilee, the land was to be restored. Right? Look at here, verse 13. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. So there was an expectation that they would return to their property. So there was a restoration of property in the year of Jubilee. There was also a restoration of something else even more significant than property. It was a restoration of yourself. Because if you became poor, if you became indebted to somebody, you could again sell yourself to pay that debt. So not only could you sell your property, which we talked about briefly, but you would sell yourself. You would become their servant, not a slave, right? You weren't to be a slave to anybody, but you would become their servant. And so you would serve the one you sold yourself to. You would serve them. And again, come back to verse 10. Look at this. It's interesting. And you shall consecrate the 50th year, proclaim liberty, so a release of slavery throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property. Watch this. And each of you shall return to his clan. Not only were they selling their property, they were selling themselves. But God put provisions in place for this situation. A person who sold himself was to be released. Now, actually, there's another release that you could talk about. We're not going to look at it in detail, but you could also look at Exodus 21:2, Deuteronomy 15:12, where every 7 years there was a release from slavery. But the year of Jubilee was another release of slavery, a release of land, a release of you from servitude. But it was a year where people were set free from their service to fellow Israelites because you sold yourself to an Israelite, free from your service to strangers who were sojourning in the land because you sold yourself to them. Look down here, chapter 25. Look at verse 35. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you bring him into your house, but the idea, I believe, is this. You should take care of him. Your brother who becomes poor, he can't maintain himself. You're to help him. Verse 38, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner, and he shall serve you. Look at this word, until. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you. They shall not be sold as slaves. Verse 43, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. So there was a time frame put in place by God. So now we come down here and we come to the end of the chapter, and it kind of repeats what we've already seen. Verse 54, and if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released. Here's this word, right? Released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So every 50th year that they would blow that horn and they would announce, this is the year of Jubilee. And can you imagine for a moment that you were so indebted, things were going so poorly, you sold your land, but that didn't solve the problem. You sold yourself. And so now you are serving others. You are living as a servant to somebody else. And so can you imagine, I mean, how many of us have found ourselves in need of and it's interesting here, but haven't we all found ourselves indebted, maybe financially, maybe not financially, but with this debt that is burdensome, that weighs on you? Can you imagine that day before you knew that tomorrow was the year of Jubilee? Can you imagine the joy that was going to come with that release? Can you imagine the expectation that was going to come with that release? In verse 35, to go back to that, it says, if he becomes poor, he shall live with you. Verse 40, he shall serve until the year of Jubilee. So there was, God put in place this idea that there would be a release from slavery, a release from, and again, the word slavery, it's actually, when you were serving, you were not a slave, or you were not to be, you were to be a servant, but there was this release from servitude. And it's interesting because the historian Josephus, of course, he wrote around the time of Christ. Josephus writes this, that Moses gave that 50th year called by the Hebrews the Jubilee. And he describes it this way, wherein debtors are freed from their debts and slaves are set at liberty. And so what a day that would be. What a wonderful day that would be. And when we come to the book of Luke in chapter 4, beginning of Jesus' ministry, he comes to his own hometown. It says, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath. He stood up to read. He opens the scroll and he unrolls it, right? Because it wasn't a book like we have. He unrolls the scroll in the prophet Isaiah and he finds the passage. This is Isaiah chapter 61. And he finds the passage where it is written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim. And again, it's so beautiful. The book of Luke is so awesome. Luke focuses on those who are outcasts. Luke focuses on those who were marginalized people. The poor, the blind, the oppressed, the captives. In our society, what would that look like, those outcasts in our society? You see, Luke focuses on them greatly. Jesus focuses on them greatly in the book of Luke, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. So look at what he is doing and look at who he is doing it to. He is proclaiming good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty to those who were oppressed. Now, obviously, we can make this all spiritual and we can say spiritually blind and those who were, we can make these all spiritual, right? The poor in spirit. And certainly those are true, but these were also things that were physical. Jesus physically went to the physically poor. Yes, it was spiritual, but yes, it was physical too. He went to those who were physically blind. Yes, he went to the spiritually blind, but he went to the physically blind. He went to those who were oppressed. And what did he do? He went there to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. I believe this is a reference to the year of Jubilee. I believe Jesus reads this passage from Isaiah 61. He rolls up the scroll. He gives it back to the attendant, right? Because he was reading it standing up. He rolls it back up. He gives it back to the attendant of the synagogue, and he sits down. And everybody in the synagogue was looking at him. And Jesus tells them, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. You see, today when Jesus began his ministry, he says, guys, today I am proclaiming the year of the Lord's freedom, the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee. For those who are have sold themselves in slavery, to those who have, this, can that not be a situation where there seems like there's no hope, or there seems like there's no possibility? But you see, Jesus says, I have come to proclaim good news to the poor. God poured out his Spirit upon me. He anointed me to do these things. He sent me to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who were oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. It's interesting, this quote. I thought it just kind of was a good summary here. As the maladies under which humanity groans are set forth, under the names of poverty, brokenheartedness, bondage, blindness, bruisedness, or crushedness. So, as the glorious healer of all these maladies, Christ announces himself. Christ announces himself. He is the healer of these things. He is the healer of poverty. He is the healer of those who are brokenhearted, those who are in bondage. Maybe it's, and again, obviously there's a spiritual application here, but there's also, there was a very real physical element to this as well. And the thing is, for us today, you know, we come to we see our life and we see the challenges in our life, and we can very well see that, you know, we live in a dark world. There's darkness all around us. There's darkness in our life. There's sin in my life. I'm in bondage maybe I'm in bondage to sin. Maybe I'm in bondage to drugs. Maybe I'm physically poor. Maybe I'm spiritually poor. Maybe I'm spiritually blind. But you see, Jesus Christ says, today the scripture has been fulfilled. The year of Jubilee began, and it wasn't just a single year. I think that don't miss the point. This was the beginning of his ministry, the beginning of a new time, and Jesus marks this time. You see, there was freedom in Christ. Christ came to the poor. He came to the blind. He came to the oppressed. He came to the sinners. He brought them good news. He brought them a message of liberation, a message of freedom, a message of release, a message of forgiveness. What a message that was. What a message it still is to us today. Thank you for your time. God bless.